So my name is Miguel Palhas. I work for a company in the north of Portugal, Subvisual, in Braga. We work with a bunch of clients, mostly abroad, and we have a lot of projects that we help bootstrap here in Portugal. We also organize a couple of conferences, if you have heard of RubyConf Portugal or MirrorConf. Right now, we're not doing any of those, but we're hiring, so let me know if you're interested later. I'm going to talk about some work that I did over the past 3-4 months at Utrust, where I was the main person in charge of releases and the continuous integration pipeline that we had. And essentially, I ended up redoing the whole thing from scratch because of a lot of things that I've been working on, and because I wanted to improve the experience due to a few problems that I'm going to talk in a few minutes. And the main problem that I ended up solving, I guess, or even figuring out that I had in the first place, was about the way that continuous integration tools worked. So we used to use Circle CI. And Circle CI, there's a few other alternatives: Semaphore, GitLab, the GitLab CI, Travis, and so on. And they all do pretty much the same thing. They take a commit, something happens, someone pushes something, and they do stuff on their side. This stuff is usually just run the tests and deploy to a live environment. And the main pet peeve I've been having with this approach, this has been for a few years already, is that not everything that we do is a commit. And to me, the perfect reflection of this is the way that we usually handle deploys. So in most projects that I've worked on, and a lot of examples that I see online, people either have a branch called production, and if they want to deploy to production, they push an existing commit to that branch, or they force push or something, or they have a branch for every release and then specific workflows that target release branches. But in fact, we're not really pushing new code to the code base. We're just moving pointers around in the commits. We're just pushing a commit that already exists to a different place or something like that. And so it always felt to me like the approach of pushing to trigger a release was it's kind of like a monkey patch. And coincidentally, that's also when I started looking into Github Actions, when they went into public beta around September last year. That's when I started looking into this. And that ended up solving a few of these problems. And to give a little bit more context, I first need to explain a little bit how we were doing releases at Utrust before this entire rework. So we had multiple live environments, a development environment where we had like development versions of our services so that developers could use them on their day-to-day work. These were deployed pretty much every day. Then a staging environment that had weekly deploys where the product managers and the QA team would go and test the next release. And when that release was ready, it would go to sandbox and production. That theoretically would happen every week as well, but there's always problems, as you may know. And we were doing exactly the branch approach, where we had a release branch for every release that we created. Usually this was a weekly release. We named the branch after the date at which we were creating the release, and that also gave us some ordering, I guess. And so doing a release was essentially pushing a commit to the release branch, and then a workflow on Circle CI would have a specific behavior for those kinds of branches. And the other thing that this got me thinking about was, so if a deploy requires a Git push or in some way a change in the Git history, let's say, then isn't that kind of a coupling to a development tool? Doesn't that mean that only developers now know how to deploy? Unless we put some other tool here in the middle to handle this for us. But just looking at this, it seems kind of weird that we're coupling a tool for developers to something that, at least in our case, our product team, the entire product team should be able to do. And also the way that we had to do things like approval steps where someone would have to sign off the deploy to production to make sure it was all right. Circle CI has these approval steps, which is something you put in the middle of your workflow and to put a button there. But in the end, at least for non-developers, that ended up being a lot very confusing, because the button actually looks a lot like the rest of the steps. So it didn't actually look like a button. And you had to explain to our QA team, a lot of them are not developers by nature. You had to explain to them what Circle CI was, why they were seeing that whole pipeline, how they would have to look for the release, the workflow, and so on. It was a bit of a mess, and we were always spending a lot of time explaining this to the team back and forth. So this was what we had at the time. And the final solution, which was what I've done for this past 3-4 months, was, I'd say, a mixture of 3 different things. The first thing, really quickly, was the GitHub API, which I guess we all know. But at least I didn't know some parts of it, because some parts actually don't show up unless you explicitly look for them. And one of them was the deployments API, which is something that after you use them, it shows up in your repo on that top bar along the releases and the commits and so on. But if you don't know it, if you don't know about it, if you've never used it, that won't show up at all. So it's kind of hard to get to know it, I guess. That's what happened to me. And what this does is allow you to create or to trigger deployments and update the status of a deployment and so on. So like we can see here, it records an activity log of everything that happened. So there was a deploy to development 16 hours ago. The last deploy to sandbox was 7 days ago, and so on. And so the API just keeps a log of all this. It doesn't actually do any deploys in practice. It doesn't magically figure out what kind of environment we're using or where we're hosting our images. It just keeps track of this. And does a second very important thing, which is where the rest of the tooling comes in, which is it sends out webhooks about these events that happened. So if I ask it, the deployments API to create a deploy, it will send out a deployment created webhook. Same thing for when I update the status and so on. And then I can have another tool on the side listening to those webhooks and processing them and doing what I requested them to do. And this is something that's CIs like Circle CI or Travis could listen to. They could listen to a deployment webhook and perform the same thing that we've been doing with deployment branches, but unfortunately they don't. And that was actually the first thing that I found interesting about GitHub Actions, was that it allowed me to do these kinds of things directly with the GitHub API. So to show a small example, using a GitHub action or creating a workflow, we can have pretty much the same thing we had in all others. This YAML syntax is pretty much standard for all of them. In this case, we're triggering a workflow on every push to the master branch, nothing new here. But then we can introduce different kinds of triggers. So instead of triggering on a push, we can trigger when a pull request is opened or synchronized. Synchronized in this case means that the history of that branch has changed. So when you force push or when you send a new commit, or even more interesting, when you create a comment on an issue. And this last one is actually something we've used in practice right away, because we had a feature where our front-end team should be able to deploy a preview version of the branch that we're working on that would link to the staging backend by default. And that way they could test a new front-end feature without having to merge them, or if they just wanted to show something quickly to the QA team without merging it to master, this was the way to do it. But it went through that whole Circle CI approval part, and it was a bit unclear how it worked. And actually one of our front-end developers didn't even know about it because he came into the team after we implemented it, and documentation, I have to say, was not our strong suit at the time. That's on me. But with GitHub Actions, this became a lot more clear because I was able to do a workflow that listened to comments created on pull requests. If that comment had the word preview on it, then the workflow would do the same thing, would deploy a preview branch to somewhere on AWS and answer on the GitHub issue or the GitHub pull requests with a link to it. And in this case, it kind of happened by accident, where this guy, Luis, he asked me something about preview branches. And because he said the word preview, the bot came into work. Then he said the word preview again, and it duplicated the work, which was kind of funny. But this was the guy that minutes before didn't even know that the feature was implemented on Circle CI because it was hidden beneath all those layers. And the second thing that I found really interesting was the way we could reuse actions between our workflows or even our projects. So we can also run regular bash commands, nothing new here as well. But we can also run what GitHub calls actions. And these actions are nothing more than actual Git repos. So if you go to github.com/actions/checkout, this is an actual repo which has a tag called v1. And this action is built in JavaScript, and it will check out the repo that we're working on with the ref that I can optionally send in if I want to target a specific branch or commit. And the interesting thing is that, first of all, this is open source by default. Actually, I don't think you can even create private actions at this point. You can go there and check the source code for yourself, or even change it if you need it. That's the usual GitHub workflow. But the way you do these actions is in one of two ways. So you can build them in JavaScript like this one. You have to create some boilerplate and add a manifest file. But since it's JavaScript, you have a lot more power than in YAML, which is what Circle CI uses, and a few others. And you can also write them using a Docker file. So you can create a Docker file that imports whatever base image you want. And inside the Docker file, as you probably know, sky's the limit. You can do pretty much anything you want. But the way that Docker file integrates with the rest of the environment and the rest of the workflow makes it a lot easier and a lot simpler to integrate compared to the equivalent thing that Circle CI has. So speaking from experience, in both Circle CI on our previous approach and with GitHub Actions, I ended up having to do a lot of custom actions or orbs in case of Circle CI. Things like pushing to an ECS, AWS ECS service, which we had some custom logic that we needed, using a Keybase repo to fetch secrets, interacting with other AWS APIs. And all of those, I ended up finding them a lot more easy to do on GitHub Actions than on Circle CI, but really by far. And just one final detail, I found this action to be really, really interesting. It's made by GitHub as well. It's called GitHub script. And this allows you to pass in a string of actual JavaScript code. And it will execute this in a context where, in a ES6 context, where we already have async awaits and all the modern JavaScript features. And it has a GitHub object, which is a wrapper around the GitHub API already authenticated. So you can already do Git calls to the GitHub API with just a couple of lines of code. Inside of the action, if you go to this GitHub script, it's doing the equivalent of an eval, which we often tend to look with a not very fond eye, I'd say. But this was actually a very useful case of an eval or an equivalent of an eval that I found. I found it a bit creative actually, because we end up having to do a lot of actions sometimes in this YAML syntax where it's a complicated curl request or something very complex that's at least in Bash ends up looking really ugly. And sometimes in JavaScript, it could look a lot simpler. So this is a simple way to drop in a couple of lines of JavaScript in a CI workflow that I found really interesting. So to sum up this whole GitHub Actions thing, I found it a lot more interesting than the approach that they do compared to our other CIs that I've used. First of all, because it consumes the GitHub API, it's not just listening to Git pushes. It allows us to create more intuitive flows like those front-end preview things that I showed. And the reusability of actions, either JavaScript or Docker, that was just way more powerful than anything I've used before. And the last of the three topics that I was going to talk about was ChatOps. And I was told by a couple of people already at some point that pretty much everyone knows what this is. But from a couple of talks that I've gave before, I didn't find that to be the case. Pretty much no one knew what I was talking about. So just to explain really quickly, ShatOps is, in this case, it was actually coined by GitHub, but that's just a coincidence in this case. They released a framework on it, and this is a methodology of work where you do all your DevOps related work through a team company chat. So for example, Slack. So instead of going to your own command line to check the status of a server, to trigger a deploy, to scale up some instances or whatever it is you need to do, you do the same command on a dedicated Slack channel, for instance. You have to build an integration, of course, building the equivalent of a CLI tool, but for your Slack, which is where this framework comes in. It's a lot helpful. But this has three main advantages, I'd say. So first of all, it preserves the history, because everything that happens, as long as it happens through that Slack channel, you can see the history of everything that happened and trace back issues or find out how stuff is done. Live documentation, because you get an actual look at the history to see how things are done. If you have a question, or if someone asks me anything, instead of just telling them what to do or point them to a documentation file, I can literally spell out how the command should work, and I'll both be doing the thing and explaining the other person how it's done. And finally, full transparency, because nothing happens outside of that Slack channel, and so it's hard for someone to do something either by mistake without someone noticing, or I don't know, like a Friday night drunken deploy, or something a bit more stupid, I guess. As long as you configure your tools to only work through that Slack channel and you restrict all other kinds of interactions, or at least the dangerous ones. And so we forked this Hubot thing, we created some commands, and this turned out to be a lot simpler for our QA team than the previous workflow with Circle CI. So like I was saying, they had to understand how Circle CI worked. They had to go there and click the approval button in that case. And I replaced that with this bot, which I was able to just tell the bot to deploy a specific tag to a specific environment. And this is a real example, a real screenshot that I took from our Slack at the time, where Martinho told me the release was ready for production, or in this case for sandbox. So I went ahead and asked the status for staging, because I needed to know what release he was talking about. And I asked the bot to deploy that same release to sandbox. In this case, I deployed both the platform, which was our backend server, and the front end. Then I tagged Martinho. And I believe this was literally the last time that I had to do a deploy on my own to production. And from this point forwards, it was only the QA team handling these releases, and even the release management and doing QA and checking in with other teams. The whole flow became a lot more agile and automated, because I was no longer having to explain people what to do, or some detail that had changed and so on. And people ended up contributing a few other commands to this bot in the meantime, which is something that I found that actually happens a lot. If you have a Slack bot where you can interact with your infrastructure in an easier way, people who end up needing it, they will figure out, okay, I'm doing this a lot more often, so I'm just going to create a command, do a pull request to the Hubot thing, and I'll be able to do this on Slack instead of just bothering the infrastructure team all the time. And that's all I had about this rework. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
So we have here Alexandre Matias in the chat asking if does the development team has permission to deploy to production services, and if so, you have any sort of dependencies from operation team.
In this case, that actually depended a bit from service to service, because if I show you this screenshot, at the time we took this, we actually had 6 different online services, and each of those had different restrictions. So first of all, every deploy would only work within the releases channel. So the bot would be usable in the entire Slack, but the deploy command would fail if it was not release channel. And even after that, it would fail if someone was deploying without authorization. So for example, our design team could enter the releases channel, could interact with the bot, but if they tried to deploy something to production, it would reject it. It was at the time I did this, it was just based on a whitelist on the source code. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
If there was any kind of dependency from operation teams to do the release.
There was mostly with the QA team. I'm not sure if you're including that in operations, but essentially we had our own development environment, like I showed at the beginning, and developers would use mostly that. But we also had weekly releases to staging, which then went on to production. And at that point, we had to coordinate with the QA team. And they had to coordinate back with us if something was not working or if they needed some clarification on the changelog. And that was also something actually where the bot came in handy, because we were using the GitHub releases to keep track of the changelogs. And one other command that this bot ended up having was to fetch the release notes for the latest release, so that the QA team could know what exactly was new and what was from 2 releases ago or something. So they could know what to test without having to ask us.
Thank you. So the next question from Antonio Carvalho, it's if GitHub is exclusive to GitHub Actions, or and if you have ever looked to drone.io.
I didn't understand the first part of the question. If GitHub is exclusive to GitHub Actions?
So probably it's if GitHub Actions is exclusive to GitHub repositories.
Okay, so if you can use like a GitLab repo with GitHub Actions or something, I guess.
Yeah.
I think the answer is no. I think it only integrates with GitHub. I might be wrong, but I haven't looked at that part too much, to be honest. And about the other tool that you mentioned, to be honest, I've never heard of that, but I'll have to make note of it.
Okay. Then Duarte Meshas asked if you, how do you do the control who have access to that Slack channel, and how secure you think the ChatOps solution is or was?
Well, the Slack channel is public, so everyone in the organization could have access to it. Even our cleaning lady had. But to be fair, we also had a lot of emphasis on transparency in our company. That's something we did and we do by default. The security was just in restricting access to dangerous stuff, and we usually do that by just blocking by default. So the deploy command, at first, the only person that was allowed to deploy to production using the bot was me while I was testing the bot. And as things evolved and as I became more confident, I began adding a couple more people until it was ready for everyone that was that had the authority to do that. But yeah, that was the only concern that we had. The other thing is that we obviously, I guess I should point out, we also put a lot of trust in our team. So again, like I said, there's a lot of transparency with this. So if someone messed up or did a deploy by mistake, it would all be kept here. And there was actually no other way to deploy. So there was also some trust, I'd say, interesting that whoever had access to this wasn't going to use it wrongly. So far, that hasn't happened yet. Oh, by the way, there's also another restriction that we had, which is the bot doesn't allow deploys to production on Fridays and weekends. That was just to keep our sanity.
Thank you. So next question from Rafael Ribeiro is GitOps also integrated in your company? I presume that he's asking if you are also using GitOps as a practices.
I'm not, to be honest, I'm not sure what you mean by GitOps. I don't think I've ever heard that term.
It's regarding using all your operation definitions, for example, the build of your environment as code that is saved inside a Git repository.
Well, in this case, that was happening by default. So the deploys were specified by the workflow on the GitHub action, which was on the repo itself. There were a few reusable actions, which were also repos on their own. So yeah, we've always done that by default. The entire infrastructure is written in Terraform as well. We always had a lot of care with that part since the beginning, I'd say.
Okay. And we also have Rafael asking how do you deal with the image promotions between the different environments, and if you do build different Docker images, or do you promote the same image across the different environments? And if so, how do you do it?
So the image is the same, but the way we do this is, so we use AWS ECS. And so for every release branch, which has a name, the name is the date of the release, like I said. Every time we need to do a deploy, we build a Docker image with that, using that name as the tag. We first check ECS, because if that tag is already there, that means that we've already built this commit, so we can skip that step. And then we update the task definition to point the new image. So we don't really do promotions like using the latest image and so on. We just use directly the tag of the release that we're using.
I think Rafael is asking if you set the day or timestamp for using with the tags. It's a bit more specific regarding that promotion through the environments.
If we use the day or timestamp,
yeah,
the tags were the date, so year, month, day, and then an extra number in case we needed to patch a release. So 4 numbers in total.
Thank you a lot, Miguel, for your talk and your insights.